The strength and size of giant animals are fascinating to us, but their considerable needs are such that their survival on this planet grows more problematic each day. Long before them, other species from prehistoric times also reached astounding sizes. After dinosaurs went extinct, giant sharks, snakes, sloths, and rhinoceroses ruled over the Earth before disappearing one day. How did they grow so big? Were they faced with major changes similar to those we experience today? Could we have anything to learn from their extinction? A team of paleontologists leads the investigation. They want to understand how such giants came into being and unravel the mysteries surrounding them. The team members will travel to the places where these giants were discovered, analyze their remains thanks to cutting-edge technology, and reconstruct the environments in which they live. They will observe their closest kin today, but most importantly, they will be projected into the past and, in their own imagination, to come face to face with these lost giants.
Those animals could weigh up to several tons, like Megatherium, which was the size of an African elephant. So finding those giant skeletons and truly impressive skulls is very exciting for us.
Here we have the top marine predator having dominated the marine environment for fully 16 million years. It would have been larger than a school bus, longer than a school bus. And then all of a sudden, they become extinct.
For nearly 30 years, paleontologist Stephen Godfrey has been fascinated with an incredible animal, the greatest predator of all times, Megalodon. This giant shark still holds many mysteries. Specialists estimate that it could have measured over 15 meters long and weighed 50 tons. And yet, it died out before the first humans appeared. But could a shark really have reached that kind of size? If so, what diet did such an immense body require? Stephen's passion for this mysterious monster started with the discovery of a tooth on this very beach several years ago.
Beautiful. That's a lovely little tooth. A lovely little Megalodon tooth. That's a great day. The tooth is intact, the serrations are intact, the root is intact. Anytime you find any part of a Megalodon tooth, it's exciting because you know you've found part of a very large shark, an extinct shark. So we know that this tooth came from the cliffs, came from these sediments, and these sediments built up on the bottom of the prehistoric Atlantic Ocean that flooded this area, that covered this area. And this came from a juvenile Megalodon. The tooth was shed, it sank to the bottom of the ocean, and then it was covered with layers of sediment. And now these layers are exposed, and as the cliffs erode, this tooth was buried in one of the layers, and it came out, it was eroded out and tumbled down onto the beach. And so we know from where this tooth was found here on the beach that it's about 10 million years old.
Teeth are the main clues left behind by Megalodon. The rest of its skeleton was made of cartilage, so few specimens withstood the test of time. Teeth did enable the researchers to draw conclusions from the location and geological strata they were discovered in. Megalodon emerged more than 20 million years ago and lived in all seas around the world. This giant did not come into being overnight. Paleontologists were able to reconstruct the entire line of sharks that gave rise to Megalodon. Over time, those ancestors developed teeth that got progressively bigger and more sophisticated.
This animal here is feeding on smaller prey. So this tooth here, without the serrated edge, is a very effective puncturing tooth to sort of grab hold of something and then swallow it whole. Okay, so it's not a particularly good tooth at cutting out sections. If you're a Megalodon, you can't eat a whole whale in one mouthful. So you have to take out sections, reduce the size of the animal.
The development of those little serrations contributed to improving the precision of Megalodon's bite. But the tooth also evolved towards a more massive and less pointy shape.
The tooth works really well because it's triangular in shape, and so they're like giant pinking shears, almost like scissors that don't have to move. And as the jaws close on the prey, the tissue is forced from this wide an opening down to the bottom of the wedge. It becomes smaller and smaller, and the tooth is cutting through the tissues as it goes.
Teeth weren't the only thing to become so big. The entire body of sharks from the Megalodon line also kept growing in size. What size did Megalodon reach exactly? In our days, the great white shark is the animal whose teeth most resemble Megalodon's. Scientists have reconstructed the jaw of Megalodon by copying that of the white shark. Their early estimation of the giant's size is over 15 meters long. The Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences is home to some of the world's most beautiful Megalodon remains. Colombian paleontologist Catalina Pimiento has been trying to reconstruct the evolutionary story of this species for years.
For the last 5 years, I've been traveling to different museums around the world where they housed Megalodon teeth, and I've been opening drawers and trays and see what they have there. And I've been taking measurements of the teeth, and with these measurements, I've been calculating the total length of Megalodon.
Each tooth is identified by a number indicating where it was found and when it was dated back to. It also gives us an idea of the size of the animal.
All the estimates of size have been based on the relationship that exists between tooth size and total length in the great white shark.
But it is difficult to know if the proposition between teeth and body size is the same for the two species. Does an 18-centimeter long tooth give a 22-meter long Megalodon? This remained a mystery for a long time, until an exceptional discovery was made. During the expansion of the port of Antwerp, workers came upon a great number of Megalodon teeth next to about 100 round-shaped fossils. These fossils were identified as being vertebrae from a Megalodon shark.
Vertebral centra from sharks in general are very, very rare. We don't find them very often in the fossil record, and particularly Megalodon, even though they're so big. And to find a whole specimen with all the vertebrae together is an amazing thing I've never seen before, and actually makes me realize how big the animal was. This specimen here is 11 meters. We estimated a maximum size of 18 meters, so that is pretty much as big as a school bus. We want to create a 3D model of this specimen and try to recreate how big it was and how robust it was, how agile it was, how big it could open its mouth.
Megalodon was an oversized giant. What did it feed on to satisfy such a huge body? Over the years, Stephen has put together a small collection of dolphin and whale bones that bear Megalodon bite marks. Was the shark a predator or a scavenger? What size were its biggest preys? To help him answer these questions, Stephen has turned to Brenton Kent, one of the top American specialists of Megalodon. The teeth marks on this dolphin vertebrae indicate that Megalodon hunted smaller animals.
We know from its size and shape, right, that it's right down near the end of the tail. So the only way that those marks could have been made is if Megalodon just catches the end of the tail and, of course, bites forcefully on it.
Right.
And you'll notice that there's not one gouge mark,
There's
but
just two.
So I can imagine the mouth opening again and coming down like and taking a second bite, like arr. And the serrations right on the side of the tooth, you know, being so powerful, right, that they're just slicing through that fresh bone.
Yeah, it seems likely to me that this would be an attack rather than scavenging.
Active predation.
Because scavenging, I tend to think of as marks that are sliding along the bone as they're kind of stripping the meat off.
Could Megalodon have attacked animals that were larger than dolphins? Stephen shows Breton the lower jaw of a baleen whale.
We know that there are multiple Megalodon bites. So when I look at this, I think of like Megalodon trying to be an overachiever. I mean, it just keeps biting repeatedly.
Yes.
Now we estimate from the dimensions of what we have preserved that this jaw would have been about 4 feet long. So you're looking at a relatively small baleen whale, 16 to 20 feet long, maximum size.
Truthfully, I think that's kind of the common size Megalodon would have been preying on.
Okay.
Within these cuts, you can see these little fine parallel scratches, which exactly match the spacing of the serrations.
So the serrations then, when the tooth struck the bone, it kind of was raked the surface.
Yes.
And you can match up the spacing then, right?
Of the serrations with the grooves, the little grooves in here, the parallel grooves.
So there's really no other shark along Calvert Cliffs that could have made that.
Right.
Do you think we can know if it's scavenging or an attack?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It's a really definitive mark, but it's not huge, so we don't know how severe this bite was.
Even if he can't prove that Megalodon killed this whale, Stephen stays convinced that Megalodon, with its powerful jaw, needed to go after prey much larger than dolphins to satisfy its considerable dietary needs. To find out more, Stephen heads to the Peruvian desert of Pisco. As unbelievable as this may seem, this desert actually used to be an ocean. This highly arid land has quite amazingly preserved fossils dating back over 8 million years. Scientists have found a great number of Megalodon teeth next to the remains of other marine animals that shared the same waters. Stephen meets with Belgian paleontologist Olivier Lambert, who has been carrying out excavations in this desert for about 10 years.
Oh, Olivier, you found something.
Yes, look at this specimen.
Wow, that's big. What is this?
Well, that's a medium-sized baleen whale lying here with the head on the side. Then you have the vertebral column spreading, taking that direction.
Are there many whales like this that you find in the Peruvian desert?
Yes, it's by far the most common whale found in these levels. Yeah. We found hundreds of specimens of that.
Are there any whales like this that you found that have Megalodon bite marks on them?
Yes, we found fragments of bones in which you can see this very characteristic bite marks made by Megalodon.
Some of the whales found in this desert bear the marks of healed wounds. The regeneration of the bones around the bite marks suggests that failed attacks by megalodons had taken place, which means that the giant sharks did hunt living whales. Megalodon then was a top predator, capable of going after the biggest prey in its ecosystem. But another discovery made in that same desert calls into question its position at the top of the food chain. In 2008, Olivier Lambert's team made a breakthrough discovery, the skull of a giant sperm whale that no one had ever seen before. As the only specimen of its kind, it was named Leviathan. Could Megalodon have had a rival as big as itself? Olivier decides to take Stephen to the Natural History Museum of Peru to show him the remains of the beast.
Wow. Crazy. Amazing. So amazing to see. So this is an incredibly large animal, and we have just the skull here?
Yeah, we don't have information about the vertebral column, unfortunately, but based on the dimensions of the skull, which are more or less similar to the size of the living sperm whale, we estimate the body length of the animal between 12 and 17 meters.
So that's certainly the same size as adult Megalodon, and do we know that they were living at the same time and in the same place?
The site in which we found this specimen is really rich in shark teeth, and in the sample we found a lot of Megalodon teeth at the same layer and in the same area, so we know that they were living together in the same place.
The shape of Leviathan's teeth and jawbone suggests that it too was a great predator.
So as you know, I'm a great fan of Megalodon, and I think that Megalodon was the apex macro predator of all time, but then I see this animal, and it's cause for pause because I'm just astounded at the size of these teeth.
The upper jaw and the lower jaw are much more robust in Leviathan compared to the modern sperm whale. So it was able to feed on large animals using the jaws to grasp the prey, which is not the case for the sperm whale. The modern sperm whale doesn't use the teeth to capture its prey.
Megalodon and Leviathan shared the same oceans, but were there as many Leviathans as Megalodons? Did they directly compete for the same praise? Was one more powerful than the other? To compare the strength of both jawbones, we need to head to Australia. Stephen Rowe heads a revolutionary biophysics laboratory. By using techniques derived from space technology, he measures the strike force of living and extinct species. With his team, he scans or models bones, reconstructs jaws, and simulates their destruction force.
One or the other of these two animals is the biggest predator that has ever existed. There's no doubt about it.
By using the great white shark as a reference, Stephen was able to study the bite of Megalodon. Simply put, it is the most powerful bite that an earthly creature was ever capable of. The giant shark could have teared apart the sheet metal of a small car.
Megalodon was just a bloody big white shark. Basically, there was nothing that Megalodon could not have taken on in the ocean, and that would include even the biggest, potentially the biggest of whales. Megalodon, it's made out of cartilage. Its jaws are cartilaginous. That means they're much more elastic, much more rubbery, and that's going to be amplified by the animal shaking its head effectively from side to side using the rest of its body. It still has to be reasonably discerning where and how it bites because its teeth, although big, are relatively fragile.
As a solution to the wearing down and breaking of its teeth, Megalodon developed the capacity of producing new ones throughout its life. Leviathan, though, had an opposite strategy.
Leviathan, on the other hand, has even more massive teeth, although considerably fewer. These are much more robust. The skull is much more robust. If Leviathan gets in there and bites into hard tissue, it's much less likely to break teeth.
Given that they had two different strategies, Megalodon and Leviathan probably shared ocean domination. In all likelihood, they didn't go after each other, but competed for the same prey. In spite of how big and powerful they were, Megalodon and Leviathan both died out around 3 million years ago. Today, the biggest shark is the great white, which is 20 times less massive. The equivalent of Leviathan is the sperm whale, which can dive very deep and whose diet consists mostly of squids.
So that's amazing. Here we have a macro predator of all times, having dominated the marine environment for fully 16 million years. And then all of a sudden, they become extinct. I think a lot of people struggle with, how is it possible that such a massive predator could have become extinct? After all, it had all the assets that it would need to survive.
In an effort to better understand the disappearance of Megalodon, Stephen would like to better understand its closest present-day cousin, the great white shark, and identify its main weak points. Sharks are most vulnerable within their first few months of life. Unlike mammals, juvenile sharks grow up without the help or protection of their parents. Biologist Chris Lowe and his team studied the population of young white sharks off the coast of Los Angeles County. Why would they choose to live here near those highly crowded beaches? To answer this question, the team of scientists closely monitors the whereabouts of a group of juvenile sharks using underwater cameras, submersible gear, and drone surveillance. So far, nobody has had the chance of witnessing the birth of a great white shark. We don't know if they are born in those favorable areas or if they come there on their own. Presumably, this step was just as crucial in a megalodon's life. Before reaching a size that would ensure their safety, juvenile megalodons were probably more or less vulnerable.
Clearly what we see in both South Africa, Australia, the East Coast, here in California, juvenile white sharks use shallow water habitats. Adults are moving more but can do and use oceanic habitats far more than we ever thought they did. So in many ways we think white sharks are using coastal habitats as a nursery, which offers protection, additional food resources. And then as they get bigger, they move further offshore like the adults.
Megalodons are thought to have also used nurseries in which juveniles could easily access food. Juvenile and adult megalodons had similarly shaped teeth, so even newborns could already go after prey bigger than themselves. A nursery in shallow waters has a second advantage.
So with so many juvenile great white sharks living close to shore, are they doing that in part because they're so vulnerable to cannibalism or to predation by other kinds of sharks? And that's a safe place for them, because probably the only other thing that would eat a baby white shark would be an adult white shark. And once they reach about, probably about 2 meters in size, then they start moving in habitats where they'll start encountering bigger sharks. I think they're less vulnerable to being eaten in those sizes.
When a juvenile shark gets trapped in a fishing net, Chris's team seizes the opportunity to collect samples and attach a tracking device on the shark. The device emits a signal, which lets the scientists follow the shark's movements across the coastal areas. Chris thinks he's identified another reason for which young sharks stay close to the shore. But first, his team must collect the data from several receivers located along the coast, which record the signals emitted by the 50 baby sharks that are tracked every day. The data, once analyzed, reveals an interesting behavior.
So it really seems like especially the young ones are really following that warm water to get in the warmest spot that they can. And when it gets too cold, they'll actually leave an area to go to a new place.
So what was that temperature range? Nothing below...
It was about 16, 17. When it dropped below 16.
Right. That seems to be a cue. They just don't like it. It's too cold.
In many ways, juvenile sharks prefer coastal areas where the water is warmer and the preys are easier to catch. As they grow up, they develop a network of veins that preserves the heat being produced by their heart. This enables them to tackle the cooler waters of the high seas and to become the dreadful predators we know them to be. Did megalodons, whose heyday happened when all seas were warm, have this ability to preserve body heat? Could they have suffered from the abrupt cooling of the seas that happened 3 million years ago? At the time, the convergence of the North and South American plates and the closure of the Isthmus of Panama blocked a warm sea current. This geological shift radically modified the planet's climate. The poles were covered in ice. Sea levels dropped. Coastal areas disappeared along with their nurseries. Certain marine species, like whales, migrated towards waters that were cooler and contained more fish. Could this have impacted Megalodon? By gathering data from all over the world, Catalina Pimiento was able to find out which seas Megalodon populated throughout its existence.
So we think that temperature changes or being cold or warm didn't really affect where the species would live. This kind of makes sense because if you think about a great white or sharks in general, they can live everywhere. Temperature alone wouldn't affect them as much, especially because when they are so big, if you have a giant animal like Megalodon, it's very likely that they were able to control their body temperatures at some extent. So we know that the great white, for example, as well as Megalodon and all the animals of that family were able to control their body temperatures. The body temperatures of their stomachs, their brains, their eyes, the most important organs. So we think that even though temperature could have affected it, it didn't do it directly.
Catalina believes that Megalodon rather suffered from the loss of coastal habitats due to changes in sea level, causing the extinction of 1/3 of marine megafauna. Around the same time, new marine competitors also appeared.
When the species start dropping in distribution and in abundance, it coincides with the evolution of new competitors, for example, the modern great white shark and also the modern orcas. Also, we found that during that period of time, there was an extinction of other animals, probably the animals that Megalodon would prey upon. Sharks will be animals that hunt alone, whereas orcas will hunt in groups, so that definitely will give them an advantage. Megalodon was much bigger though, but we don't know whether if this big size was an advantage or a disadvantage. It could have been the case that being so big made it less agile.
Or some of these predators, these new predators, may have developed a taste for young Megalodon. So maybe they were vulnerable, okay? So maybe the pups were the Achilles heel of Megalodon. We don't know, and so we're trying to figure out, was it just one factor that contributed to the extinction of Megalodon, or was it more like a perfect storm where you had several different factors coming into play that contributed to its extinction?
Bottom line is both Leviathan and Megalodon went extinct. It's popular or common for people to look at that as a failure. The reality is everything goes extinct. These were successful animals for millions of years. So the fact that a species exists ever, is a success story.
Just like Megalodon in the sea, giant ground sloths suffered from climate changes and the emergence of new competitors. When we think of sloths, we don't usually think of giants, let alone ground animals. Present-day sloths are quiet creatures that live high on the trees of Central and South America. Those sloths have extreme survival strategies. They only ever come down from the trees to do their business, and mostly they're incredibly slow. Their entire life revolves around energy saving. They are the last representatives of a very large and diverse family, which comprised giants that weighed several tons. Those giant sloths still lived in certain areas of South America 10,000 years ago. Paleontologist Francois Peugeot visits the Paris Natural History Museum to try and uncover the last mysteries of the giant sloths with the help of colleague Guillaume Billet. The museum houses a magnificent skeleton of Megatherium, one of the largest sloths to have ever existed. How did this species of sloth grow so big? Was it as slow as present-day sloths?
It was really huge, 200 times heavier than present-day sloths. Which factors could have led to such gigantism?
Remember that South America was an island continent, cut off from other continents for nearly 60 million years. The climate was favorable, the vegetation was abundant, and ground sloths had very few predators.
Megatherium's size is not the only sign of its success. In the course of their 20 million years of existence, big and giant sloths colonized all kinds of environments on the continent: forests, plains, and even coastal areas.
Do you know why it's shown leaning on a tree?
I think that it's mainly a practical decision, because for a long time, authors weren't sure whether it had a bipedal or quadrupedal posture. So to go a bit further and find out what the animal's real posture was, it would be really interesting to scan a specimen's skull, which would give us access to its inner ear. This would also tell us something about its moving speed to compare it to today's sloths.
You mean to find out if they were as slow?
In order to assess the agility and moving speed of giant sloths, Guillaume and Francois are going to scan a sloth's skull and analyze its inner ear. This is done with the new CT scan technology, which makes it possible to see inside the fossils without having to break them open. The reconstruction of the giant sloth's inner ear yields interesting conclusions.
What we can observe here in particular are those three organs that resemble rings, which are called semicircular canals. Their orientation in the skull indicates, on the one hand, that the giant ground sloths moved more often on four legs than on two legs. Secondly, when we analyze their shape and size, we see that those semicircular canals are much bigger than those we find in the inner ear of a present-day sloth, which are really small. All in all, the relative size of organs in the giant sloths is very similar to that of many other mammals, which means that their lifestyle was a lot less slow than that of current sloths.
So Megatherium was mainly quadrupedal, but a lot of questions remain unanswered regarding this animal and its extinction. For instance, did it live alone or in a group? Francois heads to an Argentinian beach for further investigation.
Hi, Teresa. How are you?
Good. How about you?
Did they start this morning?
Yes, this morning, but every time we come, we see different things. We need to clear a lot of sand off the ground to be able to study the tracks.
During each tide, the sea covers those very valuable pieces of rock with sand. 12,000 years ago, those rocks were just a muddy ground. Several animals walked on it, leaving tracks. With time, this ground was mineralized and turned into rocks that now give us a great window to the past. Teresa Manera's team must act quickly before the next tide comes along and covers the precious tracks again. Today, scientists have discovered various series of footprints stretching over several meters.
Incredible.
La última caminata.
The very last walk of Megatherium.
Those tracks don't look like those of a single animal, yet they were seemingly left here at the same time, which seems to indicate that the sloth did not live alone.
It's a left foot, which you can guess because of the shadow.
Sure.
That's another left foot.
And so you can see this fold going inwards. So this animal
Did this.
with its twisted paw, it probably pushed the sediment, which was still fresh, that way. And this one also pressed it down with its paw.
So that one was slightly ahead of the other one.
This one was following. They were walking together, clearly on all fours in this case. After 15 years of work on skeletons, it's amazing for me to finally see footprints, actual tracks of those lost animals, and to imagine that 10,000 years ago, Megatheriums were here, walking this land. Here we see a Megatherium dawdling away on all fours with a sway. It's got massive hind legs, its rear paws are turned inwards, and it's walking on its front paws. We now know that giant sloths lived in groups, which provided them with an advantage, just like it does for all African herbivores today. This helped them defend against predators, which in the case of Megatherium was the saber-toothed tiger. Megatherium was an animal with a great need for vegetation. Not only did it graze, but it could also eat tubers, sometimes fruit, but also leaves off of trees. We don't know if being a biped generally was an advantage, but in this case it might have been a necessity, since this great herbivore had substantial needs, so it needed to eat everything it came across, including tree leaves.
When the North and South American continents joined, giant sloths crossed the Isthmus of Panama and colonized North America all the way up to Alaska. Nothing stopped them, neither their relative slowness nor their considerable dietary needs. And yet, this was the beginning of a decline, which culminated when the first humans came to America and settled all over the continent. Francois is back in Paris to meet with paleontologist Karina Shishkoyan. She has collected clues that could shed light on the relationship between the first humans and these prehistoric sloths.
Look at this bone, Francois. See those cut marks? They're a sign of predation on the form of this giant sloth.
Are these the work of humans?
Yes, they are the work of humans. We can see them clearly on the bottom of this fossil, starting over here and ending roughly here. I'll show you pictures now.
Oh, that's clear.
Which I did with a microscope. Look, they are the same but enlarged.
Can this tell us whether humans hunted those animals or just fed on them?
Those marks only tell us that they fed on them. They ate the meat, which they could have gotten either from hunting or scavenging.
Did you find many bones with similar marks?
I visited various museums in Europe and Argentina. I've examined 6,500 bones, and I've only found 5 with cut marks.
That's it?
Yes, very few.
Those cut marks made with human tools show that the first humans did cross paths with the giant sloths. But even if the arrival of humans in South America and the decline of the sloth population happened at the same time, Francois remains perplexed. He heads to Patagonia at the southern tip of the continent, home to the last South American sloths.
The first humans to have arrived in South America around 15,000 years ago were small groups of hunter-gatherers. They probably hunted megafauna. We have proof of it, but it's highly unlikely that they were the ones to cause its global extinction.
If men weren't responsible, then what happened to giant sloths? It is in Chilean Patagonia, in the Megalodon cave, that the remains of the last giant sloths of America were unearthed. Although they date back 10,000 years, those remains were in exceptional condition when they were found. They belonged to Megalodons, sloths that were smaller than Megatheriums. But Megalodons weren't the only ones to have sought refuge in that cave. Researchers have also dug out remains of carnivores and even some remains of humans.
How was the cohabitation between them?
Well, this place was mainly a Megalodon's den, but it was also used by other carnivores such as panthers and saber-toothed tigers. So this place was probably quite dangerous for humans. I think that this explains why we found little human remains in comparison to remains of Megalodons and other ancient animals. The place just wasn't suited for humans.
Archaeologist Fabiana Martin guides Francois to a particular place in the cave, the exact location in which several carcasses of Megalodon were unearthed, including claws and even several pieces of skin. The dry coolness of the cave and a layer of volcanic ashes have somewhat freeze-dried the carcasses.
Luis Barrero led this part of the excavations.
3 or 4 meters deep.
Luis dug the deepest, going as far as 4 meters deep.
Analyzing these remains made it possible to reconstruct the narrative of the animal's death. The bones did not bear any marks of predation by men, tigers, or panthers. In all likelihood, Mylodons came to this cave for shelter and died here from illnesses or by natural causes. Today, those remains are preserved at the La Plata Natural History Museum near Buenos Aires. The sloths weren't the only giants of that time. The museum also houses the skeletons of saber-toothed tigers and giant armadillos. Museum curator Marcelo Reguero shows Francois remains of Mylodon. Pieces of skin with hair still attached to it. Fossilized dung, a virtually intact claw, as well as fur. All items withstood the test of time. Their state of preservation raises the hope of extracting living cells and analyzing the DNA of the last giant sloths. This is what Canadian biologist Hendrik Poignard and French researcher Frédéric Delsuc aim to achieve at the McMaster University, located in Hamilton, Ontario, near the Niagara Falls. Hendrik has already made tremendous progress in that regard by studying the remains of Siberian mammoths and North American sloths. As for the samples from the Mylodon cave, they offer a unique opportunity to determine the diet and assess the health conditions of the last sloths.
The easiest place to find DNA in fossils is usually bone, teeth, hair, and what you have to do, of course, is the DNA is tightly bound within these structures inside the bone. And so you have to use chemicals. You have to grind the bone a bit and open up the cells using different chemicals that allow the DNA to come free. But the DNA is really, really small pieces, right? So it's trickier than it seems, because in those bones, of course, you have lots of DNA from the environment. The quality of the DNA that came from the Mylodon samples is some of the best quality ancient DNA I have seen in my 25 years working in the field. The cave conditions are cold, they're dry, and they're constant. And those are the three important things for long-term preservation of ancient DNA.
Over 50% of the sequences we got were Mylodon DNA, which is a huge percentage compared to what we usually get in those kinds of samples. It's usually only a few percent, sometimes even less than 1%.
After analyzing the remains of excrements, Hendrik determined that the last American sloths had a narrow diet breadth. They only fed on a limited number of plants. This specialization made them vulnerable to any climate changes that would decrease the availability of those plants.
You find a very different flora that he was eating than what you see today. Much that their population couldn't be supported by the energy, the kilocalories that were available to them at that time.
Those changes can modify the ecological landscape of an entire land and deprive the animals of their favorite plants. Do present-day sloths have a diversified and wide-ranging diet? To find out, Francois heads to French Guiana in an animal sanctuary located near Cayenne. The team here offers shelter to sloths that were wounded or found by the side of the road.
We're going to walk quietly not to scare them. Keep them relaxed. Slow down to their pace. Look, he's smelling the air. He's looking around. He's okay.
Isabel, the sanctuary manager, tells Francois that the sloths of Guyana have developed the same form of dietary specialization. They practically only feed on one type of tree, the Cecropia tree.
In nature, they only eat fresh foliage, of course. As soon as the leaves start looking like this, they don't want them anymore. So we need to cut fresh ones for them every day.
A further proof of the sloth's attachment to the Cecropia tree is the fact that Isabel needs to release the sloths on them when it's time for them to get back to the wild. That is where they will feel safe and have direct access to their favorite food. At the genetics laboratory, the full genome of Megalodon, obtained through the remains of its bones and skin, is in the process of being sequenced. By comparing the remains of several individuals, scientists hope to measure the genetic diversity of the last Megalodons.
The long-term goals of our research are to try and understand the causes and the consequences of extinctions of megafauna. You had all these tremendously beautiful creatures 10,000 years ago walking across parts of Asia, walking across parts of North America, walking apart Canada. And all of a sudden, 11,000 years ago, they disappeared. Why? Well, one of the best ways to study that now, because the technology has changed, is to say, well, let's look at their diversity over time.
The genetic diversity of a population plays a major role in its ability to adapt to its environment, especially when that environment changes.
And so that level of diversity is an indirect measure of success of a group of animals, right? Success of a species.
Early results tend to indicate that Megalodons had low genetic diversity when they died out. This suggests that their decline was slow and progressive. As the number of individuals decreased, it became harder and harder for Megalodons to find mates, as shown by their high consanguinity rate.
Those great animals, the mega herbivores like Megalodon or present-day elephants, are inherently more sensitive to climate changes.
Gestation periods are up to 2 years, and it gives birth to one single calf every 2 years. So you imagine you reduce that population by a few animals, and you already have a tremendous reduction in potentially that genetic diversity.
So being big is actually a great strategy against predators, among other things. The elephant, for instance, has very few predators, but on the long term, it's not necessarily a great strategy to avoid extinction.
Il y a 12,000 years ago, the weather here got colder and glaciers advanced, which caused the plant life to change. Giant sloths had less food available to them, and that most likely affected their survival. Here are two of the last Megalodons of South America. Their group managed to survive 30 million years of evolution on this continent. As a specialist of giant sloths, I'm somewhat sad that I wasn't able to study those animals while they were around. But this is just how evolution works. Groups come into being while others disappear. After 30 million years of evolution on this continent, giant sloths suddenly died out. But after all, maybe it's because of their extinction, and the extinction of all megafauna, that we humans were able to colonize and thrive on this wonderful continent.
The first humans lived alongside various giant animals before those giants disappeared. In Australia, they crossed paths with the last Megalania, giant lizards that could measure over 5 meters long and weigh over 500 kilos. They also ate the eggs of Genyornis, flightless birds that could measure over 2 meters high and weigh over 200 kilos. In Europe and Asia, they crossed paths with woolly mammoths, which they represented in their cave paintings. The extinction of this megafauna, just like that of the American one, cannot be entirely attributed to the first humans, but rather to the brutal climate changes of the last ice age. The last giant animals of our times are among the planet's most endangered species. They inevitably come up against fierce competition by a new and highly invasive species. the human race. But for now, what we urgently need to do is save the last giant animals still living on our planet. The last elephants and rhinoceroses in African and Asian reserves. The giant primate and reptile populations declining everywhere. And the last whales and sperm whales in our oceans. We must urgently look after them and ensure their survival, or forever lose an essential component of our planet's biodiversity.
Survival's what